In August 1590, English Governor John White finally returned to Roanoke Island after spending 3 years delayed in Europe. He came back expecting to reunite with his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 English settlers. Instead, he found their settlement completely abandoned. The houses were dismantled, and the area was heavily overgrown. 2 carvings remained in the settlement's woodwork, the letters C-R-O etched into a tree, and the word Croatoan scraped into a wooden post at the fort's entrance. But just as important as what White found was what he didn't find. Before he left for England, the colonists had agreed on a secret distress signal. If they were forced to leave under duress, they were to carve a cross over their destination. White searched the trees and the posts, but there was no cross. For centuries, those cryptic carvings and the empty fort fueled the myth of the lost colony. The story mutated into American folklore, leaning heavily on the idea of a supernatural vanishing act or a sudden, traceless massacre. But the colonists didn't vanish into thin air. We just haven't had the forensic tools necessary to track their movements, until now. To figure out where the colonists went, we first have to understand exactly why they were forced to leave the island, and the answer to that comes from dendrochronography, which is the scientific study of tree rings to track historical environmental conditions. Each concentric ring represents a year of growth. Wide rings indicate plenty of rainfall, while tight, narrow rings indicate a lack of moisture. In this tree's cross-section, you can see the biological record of the climate when Roanoke was isolated. The rings corresponding to the late 1580s are incredibly narrow, indicating the most severe regional drought in centuries, lasting precisely from 1587 to 1589. This drought devastated the local corn crops, which poisoned relations with the neighboring Croatoan people. The colonists could no longer rely on the tribes for provisions, as both groups were suddenly competing for the same dwindling food supply. With that data, the departure from Roanoke stops looking like a mystery. The colonists were facing severe food shortages, and leaving the island was a calculated biological necessity to escape starvation. This 1585 watercolor map, Virginia Pars, was drawn by Governor John White. For centuries, it sat in the British Museum archives, detailing the region's geography. In 2012, researchers placed the map on a light table and made a startling discovery. Hidden beneath a small paper patch on the map, located about 50 miles inland, was a concealed symbol depicting a fort. This location wasn't random. When John White left in 1587, the colonists had explicitly told him they planned to relocate 50 miles into the mainland. The hidden symbol gave modern archaeologists a literal map to follow. Following that lead, teams from the First Colony Foundation used ground-penetrating radar and began physical excavations along the Chowan River in Bertie County, North Carolina, specifically at 2 dig areas dubbed Site X and Site Y. Here on the table are the results of those excavations. These are reconstructed Elizabethan-era ceramics, including Surrey, Hampshire borderware and North Devon jars. Crucially, the dig sites lacked 17th-century clay tobacco pipes, meaning this debris doesn't belong to later settlements. It is hard, physical evidence of late 16th-century English occupation. While research continued along the Chowan River basin, another archaeological team focused their attention on the coastline of Hatteras Island, the historical home of the Croatoan. Embedded deep in the coastal dirt, archaeologists uncovered 2 large piles of 16th-century iron flakes. This material, known as hammer scale, is a distinct byproduct of English metallurgy. We have Elizabethan English artifacts sitting 50 miles inland, and 16th-century English metallurgy sitting right on the coast. The physical evidence shows that the colony didn't migrate as one massive group. They fractured. Historian James Horn calls this the dispersal theory. Facing a catastrophic drought and limited resources, a group of 120 people sticking together meant certain starvation, so they split up to improve their odds. A small group likely went to the coast at Hatteras Island to wait for John White's return, while the majority pushed inland up the Chowan River. They didn't build a new, thriving English metropolis in the woods. The survivors had to rely on people who already knew how to live there, integrating, intermarrying, and assimilating into friendly indigenous societies, like the Croatoan. Without the discovery of 16th-century European burials, this theory remains supported by compelling material culture rather than definitive forensic remains. Archaeologists still seek European graves containing period-specific items that couldn't have been acquired through simple trade. But the available science paints a clear picture. The Roanoke colonists were never truly lost. When faced with a hostile climate and dwindling supplies, they adapted to the world around them. By stripping away the ghost stories and following the tree rings, the maps, and the soil, we find a community that chose resilience over disappearance.